back to the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Mark Legg, associate editor here at Denison Forum, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Josh Porter, all the way from Washington, and we're really happy that you're here. Good morning.
Good morning, man. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm excited for this conversation, but before we jump into your new book, let me give you an audience brief introduction on you. Josh is a pastor of teaching and creative vision at Van City Church in Washington. He is also a former member of the experimental art punk band Showbread, author of the novel Punk Rock versus the Lizard People, and his most recent book, Death to Deconstruction, Reclaiming Faithfulness as an Act of Rebellion. So we have a lot we can dig into there. But first, you go in some detail. It's not about your story, the book, but you do talk a little bit about your story and even some pretty harrowing details that you go into there. But could you just give a brief overview for our audience for context for this book?
Yeah, as a pastor, the guy who's responsible for talking a half hour every Sunday at our church, I've been talking about the phenomenon of American deconstruction. And by that, I mean, I realize that deconstruction is a term that's has a lot of different definition, means different things to different people, and it's either positive or negative depending on the context. But to shorthand and to, oversimplify the kind of fad of mostly millennial evangelical Christians embarking on a journey to jettison most of their Christian faith or doctrine or belief until they either deconvert entirely or, kind of fabricate a new spirituality of their own design that may have aspects of Jesus in it, but nothing like what we would describe as the historic Jesus tradition by any stretch of the imagination. That's something that I'd been talking about and commenting on at our church for a long time. We're 10 minutes from Portland, Oregon. That's where I lived for a decade. And this is the Pacific Northwest. It's not the Bible Belt. So it's especially relevant to, and our church, the demographic is very young, even younger than me demographically. It's a small neighborhood church, but it's mostly made up of like 20 somethings to early 30s, young families, that kind of thing. And it had gotten to the point where I had done enough writing and thinking and research that I wanted to compile it all in a place and write a book. I set out to actually write what would have been like intellectual arguments against the most common reasons that folks, at least in my personal experience and reading about deconstruction, tend to deconstruct. But as I sat down to write that book, I realized that book already exists several times over. There are very good versions of that book. In fact, I was reading versions of that book to do research for the book so I felt as if I was kind of adding to a conversation that was already well-rounded. If someone came to me and asked for, do you have any good books on this topic? I could point to at least 3 or 4 that I thought were very good and resources beyond that as well. So what ended up happening in the process of outlining and researching the book was the realization that set in over, innumerable pastoral conversations and experiences, not just, leading a church, but in doing music and talking about Jesus with different people around the world, was that deconstruction is intellectual, but it's primarily, in my experience, emotional. It's a reactive movement, and it kind of fuels itself on hurt and trauma and, so I realized that I had a lot to say about that experientially. And I realized that almost every conversation that I had pastorally with folks who are in the painful throes of deconstruction, they would end up saying at some point, what makes you different than me? You have all the same landmarks in your story, and in some cases, more of them. I'm from the Deep South and raised in a fundamentalist tradition and seen lots of hypocrisy and experienced lots of hurt in the church. And so the book became a kind of combination of those two things. There's still intellectual arguments in the book. It still has theology, but it's also, like you said, me telling my story, my survival story of the Christian experience, and how did I go from someone who should have a classic deconstruction story, and instead, not only am I still a Christian, but I'm a pastor and feel like deeply rooted in the Christian tradition, not just, oh, it's still an aspect of my life, but it is my life. So then you end up with this weird hybrid. It's like kind of part memoir, and it has satire and narrative, but it also has like theological arguments. So I don't know.
Yeah.
It is what it is now. It's too late to change.
No, I'm glad it ended up that way. I totally agree with you. There's plenty of good books about all the intellectual arguments, and it's good that we have them.
Yes.
I studied philosophy, and I think it's really important to address those questions. But as you say, I think maybe even more importantly at this time, addressing the kind of personal, emotional, deep existential kind of questions that arise that aren't always intellectual it's really important.
Yes.
And I have to say that, you know, I love books. I'm I'm a huge nerd, and I really appreciated your writing style in and of itself. I've been thinking about that more recently, and I really appreciate it. It's really excellent, just for that. And I hate to say that I had to skim it because of a time crunch. So I'm going to go back and read through it slowly, and I recommend people buy it and read through it slowly because it even gave me, there's a little narrative you string through, almost a parable that kind of strikes of Pilgrim's Progress.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what led you to write that and kind of string that through the book?
Well, I still, think of myself primarily as an author of fiction. I've written and self-published several novels before, my legitimate foray into nonfiction.
Mm.
And narrative comes most naturally to me. Even the kind of memoir scenes or biographical scenes in the book are kind of told as if they're scenes from a novel. There's like long scenes of dialogue, and so I gravitate toward word pictures and analogies and metaphors, and I inevitably braid those into the discourse. So like long teaching passages, if you want to, go about it, make it sound boring, but long theological essay-like passages
Sure.
inevitably become punctuated by these metaphors and analogies and jokes, or else to me, it's not just boring to read, it's boring to
Oh,
write.
yeah.
So,
Okay. Sure.
I had this thread that kept reappearing. The thing you're talking about is like this narrative within the narrative called The Apprentice. And it is very much, kind of influenced by Pilgrim's Progress. And I was using it off and on in the teaching kind of sections of the book until I realized like this to me would be more interesting if it was just its own story. And so I wrote the whole thing as a short, narrative, and then ended it up kind of splicing it throughout the book.
Mm-hmm. And would you say, just to give people kind of a flavor of the book, because I think pretty much any book that's written about deconstruction nowadays are going to have some kind of, I want to say, catchy titles that are kind of provocative a little bit. So they're going to try and draw you in that way. And then even intellectual books are typically that kind of way. But in the actual work, like you already said, it's very emotional and deep. And is it fair to say that it's pretty dark as far as the kind of undertones of it? Yeah, there's humor in there, but it's satire and yeah, you go to some pretty wild places, especially from your earlier days traveling around the country in the back of a van, sleeping on the floor, that kind of that kind of experience, So I mean, is that fair? And as you say, that's definitely on purpose. And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, not in the sense that I sat down and was like, ooh, how can I be scintillating and provocative? But
Right.
I think I realize this sounds like a pretentious thing to say, but that's just the way that I tend to make stuff.
Sure.
Is that it comes out with that's the kind of writing and art that's been most influential to me, and not not to make it sound as if I'm some kind of twisted personality. It's just that I find it an effective creative tool to be honest and vulnerable. And when I do that, it tends to go into at least some dark places. So, you sit down to write a book that I thought in the beginning was going to be intellectual, theological arguments, and ended up being
Mm.
a part memoir book with chapters, called things like Cocaine Meltdown somewhere in Middle America. And um, so, if I give myself permission to be honest and write what I would like to read, then
Mm.
that comes out. And that's my philosophical approach to art and creativity, is that I make the thing that I wish existed, and
Mm.
it may or may not land with an audience, and hopefully it does. But you end up making some unconventional things from time, especially in the world of Christian nonfiction.
Sure. Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think of some of the the greatest works is always from that position. People may not have been successful when they originally wrote it. I think of Kafka, and you can't really say, he wasn't a Christian, but he was definitely someone who was not at all successful during his time. That's pretty frequent, but they made it from their authentic kind of experience. But even Christian authors like Dostoevsky writing very dark things, and Brothers Karamazov or what have you. There's all of that in the Christian tradition. Um,
Yeah,
but
and
for you, yeah,
people like Dostoevsky or Flannery O'Connor, they belong to a tiny group of artists that are reputable in both the Christian tradition and in the literary tradition.
yeah,
It's incredible to me that somebody like Flannery O'Connor is so revered
mm,
as a figure of literature and was yet so unapologetically Christian in her writing. And, like, you can buy a copy of Flannery O'Connor's prayer journals and
mm,
read them in your morning quiet time. And I have, or you can read, her short stories that are upsetting and grotesque and strange and
mhm,
honestly, like, would particularly offend the modern sensibility because they're Southern Gothic, so they deal with race and
mm.
uh, so yeah. I mean, not in a like, oh, I'm like Flannery O'Connor at all. I'm not
Sure.
pretending to belong to the same camp as Dostoevsky, but those are the authors that influenced and inspired me the most. If I'm trying to
Mhm.
rip somebody off, it's probably them.
Yeah, and just to not to say that you're putting yourself with that, but there is this rich history of Christian tradition of the arts and literature. And I was thinking the other day, I think I kind of bought into this modern mentality of like all progress has been made by non-religious people. And I had kind of subconsciously thought that, in the arts, especially as I was wrestling with this in my own life and my own philosophy. And then actually thought back to history, and I realized that I think the first novel basically ever written, I think Don Quixote was pretty the um, had some Christian themes, and then you go farther back, the first quote autobiography of Saint Augustine, his Confessions. Then you have the first, real psychological kind of novel with Dostoevsky, and who is a believer as well. So you just see like actually these advancements in literature of even their own genres are being made by believers. There's just such a rich history there. So just establishing that, like,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. The before I wrote the Deconstruction book, I wrote a currently unpublished book about a theology of art, and particular of
Mm,
offensive art.
mm,
And the in researching and writing that book, I thought that I had at least a grasp on, like, I maybe could have not as well as you did, but articulate that, like, oh wow, there are these great ambassadors of credible art throughout church history and art history. But I was shocked by the depth of
mm,
Christian artistry throughout across the world, really, and throughout the history of not just the church, but the study of aesthetics, and like some of the
mhm,
great figureheads of um, you know, uh, art theory. Thomas Aquinas and the people who studied and gave us paradigms for what it means to be to understand art in the first place
mhm,
were people who also claim to follow Jesus. And I would argue personally that the Bible itself is the world's most sophisticated work of literature, and it's offensive and shocking and beautiful and grotesque and lovely and all the things that I love about a work of art. And when the Bible is, again, not to sound rude or pretentious or step on toes, but when the Bible is, I believe, properly understood, it inspires that kind of art. Not that it all becomes, ooh, it's so offensive and like Flannery O'Connor, but it becomes robust and it becomes dynamic, and there's a spectrum, and there's room for writers like Flannery O'Connor, and there's room for writers like C.S. Lewis, or or mainstream current modern Christian inspiration. That all these people have different avenues for expression, even if they just borrow from the scriptures, let alone tap into the rich history of, like writers and artists and musicians in the Christian tradition. So I agree. Good point. Good point, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I look back, I find it hard. So, well, let me back up a little bit. A couple of years ago, I was kind of going through this. Most of my friends in college were the creative types, and had all kinds of art they were constantly making or thinking about, and still to the same friends that I have, whether it's through poetry or writing other things, short stories or photography, what have you. And I wrestled a little bit with, where is the offensive kind of radical artist's place in Orthodox Christianity, which ironically is a huge theme that this book touches on, and kind of in a meta way, not like it's specifically set out to address that, but it is. I mean, in the subtitle, it says reclaiming faithfulness as an act of rebellion. So can you hit on that for just a second? How is it that faithfulness is an act of rebellion?
Yeah, man, now that it's out, I've gotten both enthusiasm and flack for that subtitle. I think that maybe there's a group of people who I can relate to and with that are cynical of Christian writing and pastors, and there's a sense that like, oh, this guy was one of us. He was in a punk rock band, and he was critiquing evangelicalism, which I did musically and in my art prior to writing this book, and still do, like on a but now there's a feeling of what the heck, he has betrayed us. He now belongs to the machine he once critiqued, which I don't think is true, but I understand that perception because I wrote a book that's called Death to Deconstruction. And their mockery of the subtitle is, people are like, oh, it sounds youth groupy or something. Like I'm trying to like, hey, fellow kids, really want to be punk rock, you should be a Christian. Right. But what I mean by that in the context of the book, I don't regret calling it that. Like I still feel that way, and I still say that. It's something that I have been saying for a long time. It's not a critique of evangelicalism, and it's not a critique of progressivism, and it's not a put on to try to sell the way of Jesus. If anything, to me, it's a bad sell, because I think Jesus himself was just lousy with the PR. Like you can follow me, but you have to die. And what the heck?
Right.
You need
right. I mean, he offended everyone on, like as you say, offended everyone on both sides of everything he possibly could, basically.
Yeah. Yes. And that's what I mean by faithfulness as an act of rebellion. I think that the way of the deconstruction movement is born in the cesspool of a deeply partisan outrage culture in which there's a militarizing of every opinion and belief, and there's a weaponizing of every ideology, and there's a moral police on both sides of the socio-political spectrum, and there's word police, and you can and can't say the right and wrong things, and you'll be punished or canceled, or art has to be censored. And something I've been talking about a lot lately is this strange phenomena. When I was a kid, the fundamentalism seemed to be localized on the right. Meaning the right of the theological and political aisle. And there was extreme allergic reaction to culture, and we need to control and legislate our way of life, even if people don't agree with us or believe in the same things as
Mhm.
us. And we need to censor art and cancel, celebrities and enforce our way of life on a world that doesn't even agree with us. And that
Sure.
fundamentalism has just migrated over to the left and expresses itself in all the exact same ways and sounds
Mhm.
exactly the same and is concerned with it's the exact same thing, just with different ideology
Yeah.
motivating the machine.
It's kind of like
Um,
moralism
it
almost.
is, yes, it's
Yeah.
deeply moralist, uh, and I think personally it's unthinking, and it bullies it bullies ideologies, the redefinition of tolerance as agree with us or we destroy you. uh, and I think personally that when one sets out to follow the way of Jesus, they will find themselves inevitably and consistently alienated from both sides or both extremes in any culture and any time and place. So, if I had been as old as I am now when I was a kid, if I was almost 40 in the 80s and 90s and wanted to consistently follow Jesus in Southeast Georgia, I would have been facing extreme pressure from the religious right, and the moralism of it, and maybe would have been, like, wow, this guy is a real free thinker from the audience on the left, like
Right.
he's
Right.
speaking our language. But
Mhm.
today, as somebody who's almost 40 in the 2022, consistently and faithfully following the way of Jesus puts me at odds with the left in a really
Mm.
um, provocative and uh, quantifiable way. It's not like an abstract thing. It's like you won't say and do these things, and you won't get on board with this concept, and therefore you're morally reprehensible.
Right. Well, and you even
And then
mentioned that, I mean, you're near Portland now. So there's also the Southeast Georgia versus Portland, which in an odd way was true in the 80s and 90s as well at some level, but then and it's also a matter of city versus, country. But,
yeah, absolutely.
but that divide has just become so big. Yeah.
It has. Yeah, and I'd like to think I don't mean this to sound as a braggart or something, but if I were doing the kinds of sermons that I do at my church, they're not like, world-shattering provocative sermons, but just ordinary teachings, what I think is about the way of Jesus and the scriptures, just, like teaching the Bible from
Yeah.
my perspective. If I were to do these teachings where I'm from in Georgia, I'm assuming that they would provoke a certain constituency of the audience in a really specific way and conjure their
Mm.
outrage in a really specific way. But when I do them here in the Pacific Northwest, exact same sermons without tweaking them at all,
Sure.
the stuff that would provoke the Southerners, they're amening me and clapping their hands. But the stuff that the Southerners would agree with, they're going, "Ooh, did he really say that?" And they're stopping me after the Sunday gathering and saying, I didn't like when you said this, and and to me that's just an indication that maybe I'm on somewhat of the right track. I would never presume to say like I've landed and I figured it all out, but it's a good indication that you're at least headed in the right direction. So to me, faithfulness to the way of Jesus is inherently rebellious against the status quo, against the culture in which we live, and it has proven itself historically to be the case down throughout history, not just in this unique cultural moment.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely have to agree. There's at any turn in history, there's always the faithful believers. And in those faithful believers, you find this countercultural. And I think that point is what helped me think through a lot of um, Jesus himself was very, and I don't want to overplay this, but a revolutionary. He was a counterculture type of person. And as you say, what's interesting, we actually had a sermon a couple weeks ago in my church where he talked about the story of Zacchaeus. And there's a lot of, in my young generation, our church is pretty young as well. There's a lot of animosity towards wealthy people. it's always some criticism of, they're making their profit off of these ridiculous margins, or they're not paying their taxes, or, all these different critiques, right? The whole sermon was about Jesus loved a chief tax collector, which was these worst kind of scum of the whatever, like that we can't even really process how offensive that will be to Jewish people, because we're talking about a Jew who decided to start working for the Roman oppressive government, start taking taxes from his own people, and got wealthy off of it. So you're talking about kind of and Jesus sought him out. And Jesus also sought out the poor and the marginalized, the ostracized, but he wasn't a revolutionary in the way we think of, I don't know, maybe he was revolutionary because he loved radically.
Yeah.
Because he was
the
compassionate.
The Rorschach test that I give to people in my church is, the pointing out the fact that Jesus called Simon the Zealot, and he also called Matthew the tax collector,
Yes.
and telling them that, imagine that Jesus is kind of like, making his way through a riot in Portland. And, this is in a time when for almost a year, there were regular protests that erupted into riots from time to time in Portland, just across the street. And so imagine Jesus is just making his way through this riot, and he taps, the guy in the ski mask, the Antifa, rioter with the Molotov cocktail, and says, "Hey, you have to come follow me." And the guy's like, "Okay," and turns around and follows him. And people in my church, they're like touched. They're like, "Oh, that's lovely." And I'm like, and then he immediately taps the MAGA hat guy with an assault rifle. And he says, "You too, you have to also come follow me. Both of you together. Let's go." And they're like, ugh, like there's
right.
this squirm that happens. And then Jesus is going to call both of them to a way of life that will render their previous ways of life untenable over time. But it starts with like, "Will you come? If you'll come, I'll call both of you." And there's something in there that we romanticize, that you're saying. This is an excellent point, but we romanticize now the tax collector thing, because tax collectors become a religious shorthand for not perfect person,
Right.
and less of it's more like, a Jewish person in France that's collaborating with the Gestapo officer to round up his own people during World War II. And again, I don't want to overplay it, but it's more like that than it is. Jesus called us an imperfect person.
Right.
There's some Jesus consistently read makes you on one page go like, "Oh my God, it speaks to my soul. It's beautiful and it's encouraging." And then like the next line or the next passage, you're like, "Ugh," And I'm deeply skeptical of the Jesus presented by the either extreme that never offends and never provokes. He says the kinds of things you already want to hear, and that's just about it. And the things that he says that you don't want to hear, he doesn't mean what it sounds like he means.
Oh yeah, and also I appreciated that in your book, I actually I found a place where I think, again, I was unfortunately having to skim it at this point, but I think I found a point of disagreement, so I was able to get offended a little bit, which I appreciated. I was like, "This is good. I'm reading something," and I'm sure anyone who reads it will find something like that. Which again, I think, like you're not setting out to. It's not your goal to just offend people for no reason. You're just trying to follow Jesus faithfully, and as a byproduct, as it happened with Jesus, it's just going to offend sometime. And the point of disagreement, I think, is. I sympathize with this absolutely, but I ended up not being a pacifist after studying scripture for this point, and that might be a total rabbit hole that maybe we don't go down. But I appreciated that. Anyway, I was just happy in my soul a little bit that I was able to be.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that you can be happily offended. I feel the same way, and I think that there was concern early on from not necessarily the publisher was never like, "Oh my God, do you have to say these things or that things?" They were really encouraging, and and
Mm.
didn't, unless there was a few passages that they were like, we're going to face legal action if you don't change, that there was some name calling and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Which I get, that's fine. But I, from the outset, understood that it would be impossible for me to make these theological arguments to encourage the potentially deconstructing party to consider unique perspectives back into the Christian movement. It would be impossible for me to make these arguments without either offending or just, calling on the disagreement from someone in the process. So early on in the book, I say something like, I can't step over every landmine, and I won't try to avoid offending every reader. But then later in the book, I make this argument for orthodoxy as like a vast countryside, and within it
Yes.
there are camps. So hopefully the perspective that I'm offering is not necessarily like, look, if you don't want to deconstruct your faith, you need to agree with me on every nuanced theological position. But instead, what I'm arguing is that there are perspectives within the historic Christian tradition that might provide or might alleviate some of the deconstructing party's concerns with theology and the Bible. And, if you're hung up on this idea, have you considered a different perspective? I think ideally and hopefully, there was a time when I was younger and, in grad school doing the Bible thing that I felt extreme. I'm still an opinionated person, but I felt, militant about my theological positions and
Sure.
was ready to argue with everyone in my class. And, but I was softened by years of sitting with gracious, humble men and women with really radically different opinions who were patient with me and said, like, yeah, Josh, that's fine if that's what you think. And I kind of think this. What do you think? And I was like, what? I thought that we were going to fight. And so now I'm happy to sit with, to me, the one of the most encouraging things, honestly, this is not hyperbole, but in my life, is to experience and talk to and sit with people who are faithfully following Jesus, years into the journey, decades into the journey, or who, like me, have good reasons that they could have bailed out and haven't bailed out. And it doesn't really matter to me if we disagree on the minutia of theology or even big points, but still within the home of orthodoxy. And I can say, that's fine. That's fine. Like for example, I'm Protestant. I'm not Catholic. I'm perfectly happy to read from Catholic theologians and learn from them. And then to say, like, that's great. I'm still not Catholic, but I'm encouraged by and edified by thinking that's outside of my own camp and tradition. And I feel like we have a lot to learn from each other within orthodoxy. So there's a lot of room. And all that to say, I'm glad I could offend you, Mark.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be offended. Yeah, so how did you, it's so fascinating that, and I really appreciate this, that you go, as you say, to the depths of where someone who is deconstructing is, because you've gone through that process yourself. And then you bring it back up to something kind of no one would expect, which is orthodoxy and that point. And so what made you choose orthodoxy? I think that's really interesting. Instead of, because you could have chosen maybe like the Bible or following Jesus or, but you chose orthodoxy specifically. And I think that's really wise. But what brought you to do that?
Deconstruction itself brought me to orthodoxy. The flack that I'm getting from the deconstructionists online as the book has, been released is usually over the title or presuppositions based on the title about what the book is, the voice of the book or the tone of the book. So there are a lot of people who haven't read the book and vocalize an unwillingness to read the book, but then are accusing me of, towing the evangelical line. And he has no idea. Something that I've read or that people have actually reached out to me to say is, you have no idea how painful it is to go through deconstruction, and how dare you be so flippant and so close-minded. And to which I reply, like, the book is about my deconstruction. The book is about the
Right.
pain of my deconstruction.
Did you
But
read it? Right.
yeah, I think the presupposition is that if you're going to call your book Death to Deconstruction, it implies you don't know anything about deconstruction, because if you did know, you would be deconstructed. And if you did know how painful it is, you would be on our side, not on your side, whatever that means. So,
Can you touch on how, because for people, I mean, they can read the book and they should, but what's like, how painful are you talking? In the book, you go into that a little bit just for the audience, like, how radically difficult, how tumultuous are we talking about here?
very,
Yeah.
I spent years estranged from the church, and then I spent years in the kind of a lived ambiguity where maybe I was open to church, but only if it met my unrealistic standards of perfection. I was completely shut off to conversations around unique interpretations of the scriptures that would alleviate my concerns with the scriptures,
Right.
um, and I sincerely, I would have never said this, but I thought that I was smarter and that I had found the Achilles heel to the Christian movement, and this thing ain't real, and I can show that it's not real by pointing at what I perceive to be mistakes in the scriptures, or these numbers don't match, that kind of thing, as if I was the first person to notice.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right.
and by pointing to the hypocrisy of my experience of the Christian movement,
Sure.
and by pointing to the kind of tragic evils perpetuated in the name of the Bible or in the name of Jesus, as if I, as a teenager and early 20 something, was the first to read about the Crusades or Manifest
Right.
Destiny.
Right.
And so it became, to me, it was very easy. It was kind of a cut and dry case. I was interested in preserving some dimension of Jesus. I liked the idea of Jesus, and I liked him as, like you said, a revolutionary. I liked that he was offensive and alienating. I liked that he said weird stuff like, "You have to drink my blood," and people were like, "What the heck?" And bailed out
Right.
on him.
Sure.
So the way I figured it, like everyone had gotten Jesus wrong, I would get him right and find my people who were also getting him right. And it put me in this, as anyone who's been through the process of deconstructing, really alienating place where you're stepping outside of the tradition in which you were raised, and giving everyone who loved and raised you, flawed though they may have been, deep concerns about your spiritual well-being. And, oh my gosh, has he lost his mind? Is he crazy? Does he not believe the Bible anymore? Is he going to go to hell? That kind of stuff. And I would provoke them for the sake of provoking them. That's my wiring to a fault. But would also at the same time feel deeply lonely, and estranged from the church community that had raised me, which, as problematic as it was, and as much hypocrisy was kind of, part and parcel of my Southern Baptist upbringing and my unique little, narrow perspective. There were also lovely things about it, beautiful things about it. No person is one thing only. There were people who were severely broken, but who also showed great concern for me and loved me at personal expense. And now, so even if only subconsciously, I feel as if I'm betraying people who loved me, and I also want to betray them, and that creates this cognitive dissonance. And add to that, like, I had years and years of unaddressed and kind of snowballing self-hatred that were accumulating behind the scenes, and my deconstruction was feeding on that sense of loneliness and estrangement from the church. And I think that on some level, I realized that there was something deeply hypocritical about my own deconstruction, and that I was calling other Christians up to a standard that I was not willing to uphold myself. It was more like, prove it to me before I try it, rather than let's try to figure out how to do this together, even though we're both messed up.
Mm-hmm.
And it became a very bleak place to live and operate. And I managed to do that for a long time. But all that to say, I understand the pain of deconstruction. And that doesn't mean that I understand every individual person's story. I just mean broad strokes and generally speaking, I've been there. I get letters from people who are like, well, this is where I'm at and this is how bad it hurts. And I say, I understand. I empathize. Not that I know exactly what it's like to be you, but I empathize with what you're describing and being in that place.
Right.
So to answer your first question, orthodoxy to me became eventually the relief because the deconstruction movement made a lot of promises that it couldn't keep for me personally, because deconstruction can't build and maintain a community around itself. There's no standard of shared belief. It's more like we agree not to agree with evangelicalism. And that is so amorphous and it's subjective. It's open to the interpretation of the individual. So you have some that are, gravitating toward a kind of Eastern spirituality or mysticism, and you have some that are picking bits and pieces of Buddhism or Hinduism and infusing it with, Christianity, like Gandhi or something. And then you have some who are gravitating toward this kind of new, almost universalist, but I understand that's like a junk drawer term, but like
Sure.
hyper vague. God is almost like a pantheistic God is everything, the more Richard Rohr and universal Christ and God is your dog, Christ is your dog kind of thing.
Sure.
But there can be no community around something like that other than we agree not to agree with evangelicalism. If the analogy I like to use is if you show up to the karate dojo and say to the sensei, like, teach me ballet, the sensei will inevitably say, like, well, look, you can learn ballet if you want, but that's not what we're doing here. So you won't be a part of this community or this group and this shared way of life if that's what you want. And if you say, like, well, I want some karate, but not all of it, I want some ballet mixed in, he'll be like, well, I don't know what to tell you. That's not what we're doing here.
Right.
Orthodoxy to me is the dojo. It's the we are coming together with a shared standard of belief. We agree on these things. At our church we read the creeds a lot: the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and we do it to ground ourselves in centuries of Christian tradition and history to say together. I think it's beautiful. It's stirring. Like, it riles me up in church to say with 100 other people, I believe in God the Father and in Jesus Christ, his son, all together at once, and know, like, these people actually believe this stuff with me. But inevitably, someone in the church will be like, I feel weird. I feel icky reading these things. It feels cultish and it feels strange. And I get it. I sympathize with it. I've been there. But that's what I want to belong to. I want to belong to a shared standard of belief and give myself part of my autonomy to that community of belief. All my life I've been drawn to that idea of giving your life to a cause, sacrificing your youth and your autonomy in the name of something bigger than yourself. And I don't think that's exclusive to me. I think that's part of, like, the human condition, to want something bigger than you, that's why we love movies where, the down and out person at the bottom of the barrel gives up everything to go learn a way of life under a master. And we're like, oh man, it's so awesome. And we love the training montage, we want to live that out. And deconstruction could not offer anything like that. I thought that it would. I thought that it would, like, this would be the new subversive camp, but it felt to me deeply, it felt to me more herd mentality driven than the evangelicalism I had left behind. It felt to me like tribalism. It's more built up around what we're against rather than what we're for. Which speaks to part of me because I'm rebellious by nature and, like a contrarian to a fault. But it only gets you so far. It's like, are you hungry? Here's cotton candy. And you're like, well, this tastes great. And it was satisfying for a second, but now what? There's no meal after this. And, like, well, that's it. That's all we have to offer. I wanted something more than that. And orthodoxy to me is the more.
Yeah. I love that. I love the picture of what deconstruction, I mean, just the word itself. You're destroying, you're taking down, you're deconstructing. You can't construct with that. You have to build something, but then to return to orthodoxy and find that there is this solid foundation, this kind of building, whatever that may look like, that's been built on Jesus's teaching. You know, even just his parable about building your house
Yeah.
on his teaching, on not on sand. That strikes home to me because I mean, I think it strikes home to pretty much every young person because there's always that need to. Some feel it more than others, but there's typically that need to depart from your parents' ways to find to try to find what you truly believe and buy into, and to be able to leave and then come back strong into orthodoxy, and then to I mean, it's just beautiful to be able to read the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, that's centuries and centuries and centuries old, and to return to that to me, and then to live out in community with people who are broken like you. I mean, that's what the church is. Man, how powerful is that? I mean, that is what Christian community is. Like it's so funny. I find myself rediscovering truths that I already knew by a different way. Um, you know, sometimes if my family believed something, I'll kind of try to depart from it and see what I think, and then I'll return to the same belief later through a different way. Um, I don't
Yeah,
know. I
and
do. So I
that's
really
part of
appreciate.
spiritual formation, that the transformation process we all have to undergo in order to follow Jesus faithfully.
Mhm. Yeah, and that it's true. And I think that's also the other piece of the puzzle, that it's not just that we find great community, although that's true. It's not just that we find this very cohesive old tradition, because that's also true, but it's actually true. Like Jesus is the Son of God. You know, it's not just like we're saying it. It actually reflects reality, and that's something that. But you can't always get there through the intellectual means. You know, as a
Yes.
philosopher, I kind of wish you could almost that everyone would just be objective. I don't know if I actually wish that, but you know, you kind of are like, well, look at this argument, and
Yes, it's easier. That's for sure. It would be comforting to rely exclusively on empirical and objective. Well, it's settled. But and maybe this is, as an artist, or maybe it's just part of the human condition as well. Um, I, I think inevitably that we all follow something, we all believe something. The deconstruction
Mhm,
movement also makes this claim that you'll find a comfortable seat in the ambiguity and a kind of lived agnosticism where, you can be like, who knows, whatever. And we're not, given over in subservience to any one master, but we all follow a way of life. And because you can't live out a worldview any other way, we all believe in some kind of objective truth, and we all believe, um,
mhm,
whether we vocalize it aggressively or not, that one thing is true and another thing is not true. And we also all believe that it would be better if other people agreed on the true thing and left behind the thing we think isn't true. And that's the case whether you're religious or non-religious. It's just an inevitability of life in the world. But
mhm,
I think that, I dispensed with um, the reaching for metaphysical certainty in the world of
mhm.
theism a very long time ago, and have always.
Sure.
I think that was something that I was comfortable with even in the throes of deconstruction. It seemed to me that there would be some level of irresolvable mystery to life in the
Mm,
world as a finite human being, and I could make my peace with that. It was these other trappings and infrastructures that were more troubling to me, or it was, the Bible, or it was the church that were more troubling to me. I could sign off on the idea of God. And again, like I said, I liked the idea of Jesus as his teacher and a provocateur, not so much
mhm.
when he told me to do stuff I didn't want to do already.
Sure. Sure.
But I was just reading last night, Nick Cave, who's a musician and songwriter and has written extensively about Jesus and God and the scriptures and wrestled with them publicly in his music. And
Mhm.
he was talking about the idea of something being quote true enough unquote, and by that he meant that he was coming to a place as he got older where he no longer became less and less concerned with objectivity and like closing the chapter on things like, you know, the Christian tradition and like, okay, fine, I've settled it, I've wrestled through them all, and being comfortable with true enough. And by that, I think that he meant, and this is me reading into him a bit, but by that, I think he meant being like, this is what I choose to believe. You know, it sounds like a lazy intellectual perspective, but we all make that connection of faith. And this sounds like an old Christian, like everybody has to have faith in something, you know, or we like to, theists like to make the jab at atheists as if we're the first people to think of it, like I just don't have enough faith to be an atheist, you know. But what we mean by that is that every worldview requires some level of faith and belief in the faith while we are in want of metaphysical certainty. And you know, I'm getting letters now from people who are making totally legitimate claims or asking legitimate questions about like, well, what do you do with the fact that if you were born and raised in a different country and culture, you probably would have been a devout Muslim? And, or what do you do with the fact that this thing, you know, like classic philosophical arguments, and I'm fine with them. I'm fine with the intellectual journey. I'm fine with asking the questions. They don't offend me. They don't bother me. I don't think they offend or bother God either. And I'm also fine with being like, this is what I believe. I believe these things deep down in the depths of my soul. I believe them. I don't think that I believe them ignorantly or with no evidence, but they are beliefs. You know, they are. It is not like, let me show you the flow chart and how I got here. I don't have a Venn diagram for you.
For any kind of worldview claim, like as you say, it's not that kind of question are not mathematical questions that you can 2 + 2 is 4. You know, this argument, I mean, the closest thing, if you want to look it up, any of our audience, you can look up the ontological argument for God's existence. That's kind of the closest thing you can get to. But you know, to your point, the certainty, there's actually a fascinating, I was on a podcast with Patrick Miller, who is over a place called Truth Over Tribe. And he was talking about how certainty is actually a good indicator of relativism. So, and he basically put it like this. If you ask someone about their opinion and you say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how certain are you about this thing? If they say 10, they're probably relativistic. Or if you ask them, what outside evidence would convince you otherwise? And they say nothing. Then that by definition means that they're finding it from internal, which means they're relativistic, meaning they don't believe in an absolute truth. And so you see that kind of thinking on the right and the left. You know, you might not have the name postmodern or a relativist. You might not associate with that, but say you believe in some conspiracy theory and you have that kind of certainty. And that was actually a big eye-opener for me. That was helpful to me to think about. And even just a practical way to ask people that question. Are you 100% certain about this? Then you're probably not going to change your mind by some kind of outside influence, by the actual truth.
It scares people. It's a scary idea to relinquish your purported claim on, you know, belief, or to describe it as belief. Yeah, I at one point, I don't think it was my analogy. I probably got it from someone else, but I think I publicly made the comparison to my worldview and my faith as something akin to flying commercially, in the sense that, you know, I have enough faith and belief that if I buy the plane ticket and get on the plane, it's going to go from point A to point B, land safely, and I will get where I'm going. And I live that faith out. I go and get on the plane and I fly. I understand that I could be wrong in the great metaphysical scheme of the universe.
Sure.
But I'm willing to, you know, practice that faith. And for some people, I remember saying that in some public sphere, and some people were like, "Oh, that's helpful. Yeah, I get that, and I agree." And others were like, "Oh my God, it sounds so tenuous that way. It sounds as if it's really, really up in the air." And I don't mean that, because for me, it's not up in the air. And at the same time, I'm able to acknowledge, like, well, of course I could be wrong about anything that I think, but I
Right.
believe these things, you know?
Yeah, and there's a difference. Like, it's good to draw the difference between God is certain. He is all powerful. He is not questioning himself. He's not questioning his own existence. There is objective reality to that. He knows all truth. He's not questioning that. He's not confused. So in that sense, he is a fortress, regardless of our belief. If no one believed in God, he would still be there. So in that way, he's objective. But then our knowledge of that, as you say, I mean, just admitting, I could be wrong about anything. I could be. I don't believe that I am, but that word faith even just means trust. I think is another way to translate pistis. I think. Um, so I 100% agree with that, and I don't want our audience to think we're saying like we're just gonna make this leap into the darkness, like we don't have any kind of, but we're actually like the Lord is there. It's just that we can't be certain, but we can still trust him. And
Yeah,
I
and I
feel
think,
comfort in trusting him as Jesus. Like I'm trusting a person. I'm not just trusting these arguments that I have because I know Jesus.
yeah.
So
Yeah, and I think, there was a time, and there probably is a time in the discipleship journey of anyone who sets out to follow Jesus, when apologetics and
mhm,
arguments for the existence of God, the legitimacy of the Bible, the historicity of the resurrection become really important. Um, and I went through that process as well. And I read you read and reread Mere Christianity, and you read people like, I don't
right.
know, William Lane Craig, or the early books of Greg Boyd when he was an apologist. Um, and you go through or even what was the big best, The Case for Christ or something like that.
Hmm.
And I had a professor once who pointed out that books like The Case for Christ, and he didn't mean it as a jab at all, but he said that those kinds of works are probably most sought out by Christians looking to fortify their faith, which I think is an important part of the discipleship journey for certain types of people who gravitate toward a kind of question asking or skepticism. And I was one of them. I am that by nature. Um, but at this point, it seems to me that one of the sillier arguments that both the Christian and the non-Christian could make is that there are no good arguments for either thing, or
Hmm.
that either side has the silver bullet to the other's perspective, or that there are no intelligent, credible people on either side of this discussion. If
Right.
you and I were to have integrity, we would have to admit that there are intelligent, educated people who do not believe that God exists, or who do not believe that Christianity is legitimate in its
Hmm.
historicity, or claims, or Jesus claims, that the Bible has been tampered with or flawed, or that kind of thing. That there are intelligent research people who believe these things. But it would be equally ridiculous for the person in that camp to make the same kinds of claims to the other side, to say that there are no intelligent disciples of Jesus, or that there are no credible historians or philosophers or mathematicians or apologists who believe that the Bible is historically reliable, that the Gospels are historically accurate, that God arguments for God's existence are credible philosophically. And um, so it becomes a kind of choose this day who you will serve moment, in which, yeah, you can, I would never presume to say like, oh, these atheists are all so dumb, and
Right.
they just haven't read enough books. That's one of the most hilarious arguments against anyone, that, and even within Christianity, little theological debates where, well, you just need to read this one book and you'll be as if, if you just knew what I knew, you'd believe the same thing I believe.
Right.
And
Right.
sometimes that maybe that's the case, but the argument that, like, oh, they just don't know anything. And no, there are lots of people who know a lot of stuff, and they're really smart, and they believe things that I don't believe, and vice versa. Um, So if what you're looking for is to find the camp who's most credible, you're essentially just picking a team based on sensibilities. And you can do that if you want, but it's not necessarily the most intellectual way to go about things or the most
Right.
satisfying, ultimately, way to go about things. So I'm happy to acknowledge that dichotomy, embrace it, and be like, this is what I have chosen. I have selected for myself a master, and I'm going to follow him forever.
Yes.
And I'm happy to acknowledge mystery, and I'm happy to say that that I've got to be wrong about something inevitably,
Right.
even within the things that I say and teach and believe. And I think that I'm right, and whilst knowing that I have to inevitably be wrong about something, but I'm going to continue in faith. I think that's all any of us can do, really, is continue in faith.
Yeah, that's a good word. Josh, thank you for your perspective as an artist with the background that you've had, with the story that you have, the writing capability that you have. The Lord is clearly using you exactly where he wants to use you, especially in writing this book, which I'm so thankful you wrote. That's Death to Deconstruction, Reclaiming Faithfulness as an Act of Rebellion. You can look him up as Joshua S. Porter online and see what he's up to. I understand you're still involved in some musical projects and things of that nature, so you can definitely go look to those things as well. And we're so thankful for you, and appreciate all your insight. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Dude, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for entertaining my rambling and talking with me.
Yeah, if you're ever in Dallas, we should hang out and
Totally.
talk some more. An hour doesn't quite cut it, but we're thankful to all of our listeners as well. Please rate and review the podcast and check out Josh's book. God bless.
Thanks, dude.